So thank you all for coming this morning to our talk on VR and fitness. This webinar is hosted by the USC SMART-VR Center, which is funded by the USC Office of Research. To learn more about our center and events, see our website at smartvr.usc.edu or follow us on Twitter at USC_SmartVR. Today we have with us Jimmy Bagley, founding member of the VR Institute of Health and Exercise, Nejc Skoberne, who is product manager at FitXR, and finally James Finley, who serves as co-director of SMART-VR and principal investigator of the USC Locomotor Lab as our co-host. And with that, we can begin with Jimmy Bagley on the VR Institute of Health and Exercise.
All right, can you all see that? Great, thanks. Thanks again for having me here. I appreciate it. So I am Jimmy Bagley. I'm an associate professor at San Francisco State and one of the founding members of the VR Health Institute, which I'll be talking about today in this lecture. All right. So again, I'm at San Francisco State University up in the Bay Area, and I'm going to plug our program here. So I know there's a couple undergrads that are watching today. If you're interested in a master's program in kinesiology that has research in virtual reality, then you might consider our spot. So there's our links there if you're interested in that. A little bit about my kind of research background, how I got into this whole field in the first place. So I'm an exercise physiologist by trade. I studied muscle physiology, strength and conditioning, and just general exercise physiology. And when I got to San Francisco State here, I helped set up our exercise physiology lab, strength and conditioning labs, as well as muscle physiology lab. So I had no knowledge of VR 5 or 6 years ago, besides what I had seen on TV or played with. If anybody's used the Samsung Galaxy Gear, that had been out for a while. So that's all I really knew about VR kind of going into this whole thing. But my research, I really have like kind of integrative view of the body and of physiology in general. So I like to look at the whole body all the way down to the molecular level. And then anywhere in between there, you can think about organ systems, cellular level. It's a great way to look at physiology, especially when you're trying to study things like exercise. So again, we got systems and everything, but then over the last few years, what have we added? A little bit of virtual reality in here to see how that kind of plays a role in that. And our whole goal in our lab is really to improve human health and performance. You know, we typically work, we work with mostly young, healthy adults, but we also do work with some clinical populations and older adults as well. So most of my research is really on younger, healthy populations, but this is super translatable across the board. So I just want to point that out as well. Okay, so you don't have to respond because we're all virtual, but has everybody used VR here? I'm sure there's some people in the audience who have not used VR at all, and it's going to be hard to explain, but I'll try to go through this. So if you've never used a VR system, and I'm talking about things like the Oculus Quest or Quest 2 or Oculus Rift or HTC Vive, those kinds of setups, that's what we're going to be talking about here today. So in this talk, I'm going to try to cover a few things. One, is VR gaming a valid mode of exercise? So this was a question that was posed to me a few years ago. I was a little skeptical at first, I'm not going to lie, so I'll talk about that. And then what are barriers keeping this from going mainstream, right? You don't see VR everywhere. It's starting to get more and more popular after, you know, movies with VR come out and stuff, but what's keeping this from going mainstream? And then is this the future of fitness? So I'm going to try to get through all those. The first chunk will be about that. Is VR gaming a valid mode of exercise? Let's backtrack a little bit though. So I said I hadn't heard about VR or used it much up until about 2016, 17, but I've always been interested in technology. So technology is just the application of scientific knowledge for a practical purpose. It's been around since the beginning of time. So a pen could be technology, but now we have computers and VR, stuff like that. So I'm not expecting you to read this, but I wrote my first grant proposal at age 10 to my dad because I wanted a laptop really, really bad. And this was, you know, mid 90s. Laptops were not around. Maybe if you watch movies like Jurassic Park or Twister or one of those movies, you saw a laptop and it was the coolest thing I ever thought. So I wrote this to my dad and I was like, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm responsible enough to have this. I'm just asking nicely. And then eventually my family put all their, you know, funds together and they got me this really cool Toshiba laptop. And that kind of kicked off my interest. If I didn't have this laptop in the 90s, I was really privileged and fortunate to have that. I definitely would not be doing what I am doing today. So kind of backtracking even farther, if we think about emerging and converging technologies, what are we doing here in 2021? Well, it's kind of based on this exponential growth of technology, starting really with the printing press all the way back into the 1400s. So I know you probably didn't expect to get a little history lesson here, but I'm sure you're familiar with some of this. So once the printing press came out, technology was able to exponentially grow over time. We got really cool things like telescopes and microscopes and cars and airplanes. And now we have things like human gene editing, and it's just getting crazier and crazier. And the few things, the technology that we use in virtual reality is, and especially in our research with metabolism, is things like a portable gas analyzer, which I'm going to talk about, how we measure metabolism during exercise or VR play. The VR headset came out actually quite a while ago. The first ones were early, mid 1900s, and then social media, and then artificial intelligence. So I'm going to talk about the start of the VR Health Institute. We're an independent group of researchers really around the world. And, like you mentioned, I was one of the founding members, but the reason why they found us was because a guy named Aaron Stanton, who is the director of the VR Institute, basically Googled San Francisco Exercise Physiology Lab and found us. So we're surrounded by tons of companies, right? Tech companies, tons of universities. But we have one of the only human exercise physiology labs in the Bay Area that does research. So you can see behind me, I'm actually in the lab now. Finally got the okay to get back in the lab because of the pandemic. So I'm really excited about that. But we're in the lab doing research. This is kind of a timeline that you can see. Started thinking about this in about 2016. My former boss, she's retired now, Dr. Kern, met with Aaron, and they started discussing VR as a unique form of exercise. And this was a time when Aaron mentioned to me and Dr. Kern was like, hey, I think I'm exercising. I'm playing these VR games and I'm sweating. And, I was thinking like, oh, this is just, a sympathetic response, or it's, you're just stressed, or I didn't think it was exercise at all until I put it on and I started playing games, and I was like, all right, this could be exercise. So we need to investigate this a little bit more. And then we did our first study in 2016 and our first published ratings, where we actually rate games based on how many calories you consume, was published in 2017. And we've been doing that continuously since then. So here's a link for the VR Health Institute. If you do play VR games and you're interested in seeing how many calories you consume or burn while you're playing those games, and it's not on this, go ahead and send a message on here. There's also, I'll mention in a little bit, a Discord board. You can comment on there and see if we can rate some of those games for you. Okay, so I've mentioned metabolism a little bit, and if you're not an exercise physiologist, you probably don't know what VO2 is, or you may have heard of VO2 max. So you see people like the Tour de France or in the Olympics wearing these face masks, right, with a machine like the one over my shoulder here. And what we actually do to measure metabolism while you're moving or exercising or even resting is look at your volume of oxygen consumption. So your muscles are using oxygen and they're expelling CO2. We can measure the gas exchange from your mouth, O2 consumed and CO2 out, and we can see, basically convert that to a couple steps and see how many calories you're using. This has been around for a while. So some of the first gas analysis systems were in the 1800s. They didn't get that good until a while. And this was considered a portable system. You could tell it's on a desk, so the desk would have to be portable, but it's not really that portable. And now this is the system that we're using, not quite portable either, although we can wheel it around a little bit. But this was the first time we ever hooked up anybody using the HTC Vive. I believe that is 2016 or 17. That's Dulce. She's attached to our CosMed metabolic cart behind me, measuring how many calories she's consuming during exercise. So this, the technological advancements of this has been pretty profound since 1900. So this is what one of the first actual gas measurement tool looked like. I mean, I think it looks like a hookah or something, if you know what that is, but it basically the same idea is you can measure oxygen being consumed with a device on here. And then up until the 1940s, we had a lot of technological advancements come out. You got more of a little backpack setup. And then in the 1950s, this was a big deal. Like when you see that exponential growth graph, 1950s microprocessors came out and that made everything tiny. That's why we have headsets that are relatively small. And then up until, 1989 into the 2000s, the systems are getting better and better and better. Right now we're working, with a company called Pinoe, where we've looked at smaller units And we're looking at validity and reliability of these new technologies. So what we'll do is put people on our bike or our treadmill on our system and compare that with some of these portable devices and looking at that. And these are really great because, again, these things are cloud-based. So you could be at USC and I could be in San Francisco, or you could be in England or wherever, and we could be measuring real time. So this is one company that does that. There are several companies, and we found, again, really this is VO2 on this left axis here, and then power in watts on the bottom. And you can see that they're pretty close. And what we've noticed is some of these portable devices are relatively accurate at lower intensities, relatively reliable. Problem is when you get to high intensities, you start changing environment, the reliability kind of is not as good. So we're still working on this. The goal would be amazing to have a virtual reality headset you could cruise around in, a very valid and reliable setup like this to measure calorie consumption while you're moving around. Okay, again, so in this talk, I haven't even covered, I'm a couple minutes in, we're gonna talk about, is VR gaming a valid mode of exercise? So to show this video, our lab's been on random TV channels quite a bit, but this is what this system looks like, or the setup looks like when we hook somebody up to our metabolic cart, is what we call it, measure oxygen consumption while they're playing games. We also use heart rate because heart rate goes up linearly with oxygen consumption as well, and it's a good analog for that too. So again, if you haven't seen it, that's kind of a good representation of how active you can be during virtual reality gameplay. So the first study we actually published, if you're in research, you know that from the time of a idea of a study to the publication time could be years. In this case, it was about 2 years. So we did pretty good, I think, getting this published in 2 years. But the first study looking at metabolic cost during active VR gaming was with our past student, Dulce Gomez. She's now a PhD student at University of Auburn. So what we did was we looked at 3 different games, a rhythm game, an archery game, and a boxing game. And we tried to compare those to people's exercise on a treadmill or at rest. So at rest, everybody sitting here, you're probably 3.5 would be the textbook number, but you're probably 3.5 to 5, what we call milliliters per kilogram per minute. So that's your oxygen consumption, that's resting. Well, when we had somebody playing a rhythm game, we actually found that that was significantly increased. And this game doesn't seem that intense, but you're actually, burning as much calories as you would be if you were biking at a relatively moderate rate. So 10 to 13 calories a minute, that equates to about a little under 20 milliliters per kilogram of VO2. So that was exercise. We found that one out. And then archery, this one was even tougher. This was a pretty cool game. This one got up to 13 to 15 calories a minute. And again, I kind of disconnected. So VO2, we can calculate calories from oxygen consumption. And then finally, we did a boxing game. And this one was one of the most intense games we've tested so far. I think this was Thrill of the Fight. It's been around for a while, pretty good game, but this was 15 plus calories per minute, depending on how intense you're doing it, which is pretty hard not to be intense on that. So I guess this was our first study. We found that it is exercise. Cool. So I was wrong. I'm always skeptical though. I'm a scientist. You have to be skeptical, but this is exercise. But that's not even the most interesting thing we found. So Dulce continued to do some research on this. And if we look at the American College of Sports Medicine, that's kind of how we rate intensity. The rhythm game was light, the archery game was moderate, and the boxing game was vigorous intensity. So all exercise intensities were above resting. But we also looked at a thing that you might be familiar with called rating of perceived exertion. So this is how you feel when you're exercising. And we always ask this when somebody's on a treadmill or a bike test, basically to see when we know they're going to stop. But what we found was on a treadmill, we measured this at these exact intensities of a person on a treadmill. And don't worry about the scale on the left, but that's where they were at. And again, this is a group of 40 people, so it's a pretty decent sample size. But how they felt like they were exercising was light, and moderate. So they were consistently across the board thinking that they were exercising at a lower intensity than they actually were. And I am not a psychologist, an exercise or sports psychologist, but I contacted some of my psychology friends, and that's kind of led us into some more research that we're into now. So this was pretty interesting, great for gaming too. So if you're playing a game, if you're playing a basketball or soccer or anything outside, you usually are exercising pretty hard, but you probably don't feel like it. So that's a good thing, I think, if we're trying to get people to play more games and exercise. Okay, so then we kind of did, a little more research. This was a study with Trenton Stewart, who was another graduate student that we had in the lab, and he continued to do this. And I don't have a lot of the data here, but this is from a poster presentation about a year ago. And he reported again that RPE was consistently lower across the board. And we were thinking maybe if you're an experienced gamer or a novice gamer, that would affect it. It didn't seem to matter in this case. So whether you're new at this or not, it seemed like across the board, the perceived exertion was lower. So yes, VR gaming is a valid form of exercise. I think that's why we're all here. So that's great news. And then I know, Nick from Box VR is here. There's other games, Supernatural, Beat Saber. Some of these really popular games are out and they're being used for exercise daily by thousands, probably upwards of millions of people at this point, depending. I don't know exactly how many headsets are out there, but there's a lot. So this is good. So check. It is a valid form of exercise. Next, what are the barriers keeping this from going mainstream? And this is something we've thought a lot about. There's probably a lot of barriers, but I kind of broke it down into a few. One of them could be gaming culture. So I grew up gaming, and it was one of those things. My dad, when I was a little kid, had Nintendo NES, an Atari, and I was playing these games and stuff. But my parents would always say, go outside and play. You got to get some exercise. You got to move around, right? So gaming culture's always had kind of this sedentary lifestyle aspect to it until now, where we have really great games that you can actually get pretty good exercise with. So we need to try to gamify fitness. And I think that's happening, especially over the last couple of years with this pandemic. People have been stuck inside. I'm sure VR, I knew that Oculus was out of stock for a long time, and I think people are continuing buying these to play games. Another one's accessibility cost. That keeps going down as the technology comes out more. Not everybody has hundreds of dollars to spend on these. So if we can get the technology and the cost down, that would be ideal. And then some of the stuff that our lab and other labs are working on is looking at things like engineering, hardware and software. So I'm not a software developer, but after playing a lot of these games and seeing people playing, I can kind of know what we need to do. So that's where I come in. One thing we've been looking at is improving comfort. The headsets are comfortable if you're sitting there, but they might not be comfortable if you're gaming for hours and sweating and stuff. So there's, fans on there that you can add, and there's rubber little coverings that you can wash if you're sweating and stuff. And these are great and these are working. But I think as we get these smaller and more compact, that's going to get better. Motion sickness has been a problem in the past. It's getting better. Everybody always asks, but it's really usually if the game's laggy or if you're moving and the screen's not moving or vice versa. That's when we see people getting motion sickness. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but it's usually not a problem for most people. We need to improve fitness tracking. Now people are using AI to help do that. So we can track your calories without using, hopefully, the metabolic cart that I have behind me, because not everybody's got 30 grand to spend in a place to put something that huge. So we can improve fitness tracking and design new modes of VR and augmented reality as well. So VR, AR, XR, all these things are kind of going to be the same thing, I think, in a few years. Okay, so how common is motion sickness? This was Angelina Wong, one of our students as well. We did some VR cycling games and we looked, and motion sickness was a problem in, about 15 to 20% of the people that played these games. But again, I think there was a disconnect in this. And if you look, when we do research, we use a questionnaire called the Simulator Sickness Questionnaire. And there's no significant increases. Well, it looks like there's increases, but there's actually no significant increases in nausea, disorientation, ocular motor ability, or total severity of your simulator sickness scores. But there was a trend, after VR cycling. So we're kind of working on that and seeing why. But again, I think this is a hardware software issue. This is stuff that we can easily, or can be easily fixed. Not me, but somebody else can fix it. And then what are the best ways to track fitness in VR? So this is what everybody's thinking about. Again, not everybody's got this metabolic cart. We recently published a study. This is one of my students, Julissa. And what we looked at was things like VO2, what we use in the lab. We use the movement tracking tools, which are inside the headsets and hand controllers, as well as heart rate. So heart rate's really popular. And what we found was the movement actually tracked with kilocalories or calories pretty closely. But the heart rate, which we use quite a bit, was way off. The heart rate continuously over-predicted calories when we're comparing VO2. And we were kind of surprised by this. And this was just using a standard heart rate monitor. So there was nothing related to VR on it. We were just measuring heart rate and using a standard calculation. And so what we found was if we looked at this, main findings are this plot difference, as you can see, as basically intensity goes up, the validity of this heart rate monitoring goes down. So movement may actually estimate VO2 a little bit better. Heart rate tends to overestimate VO2 or calories at a higher intensity. And then new algorithms for heart rate should be developed specifically for VR gameplay, because we know VR gameplay is a little different than a bike or a treadmill. So what our lab has been doing is we've been working with, again, the VR Health Institute to develop this app. This app is still under construction, but you can, or under development, but you can download it and check it out for yourself. And we have a Discord channel on here. If you have any comments, questions, concerns about it, it'd be great to be able to, to get some feedback from you. So right now we're in the feedback stage, but what we're trying to do is, heart rate's pretty accessible. Most people can do that on the watch or a heart rate monitor around your chest, is how can we get this to more accurately measure calorie consumption? So again, this is a work in progress. Okay, so those are just some of the barriers. Obviously, I can't really talk about cost. I wish I could make these things free, but I know people have to make money. So I think it's going to get more accessible and inexpensive. And if you're looking for a VR headset today and you want to play games, I think the Oculus Quest 2 is probably the most accessible one that you can use. It's a standalone, so you don't have to have a high-powered computer to use it. So check out the Quest 2 if you're really interested today. And then the next couple of years, it's going to keep getting better and better and better. And then finally, is this the future of fitness? So this is kind of the big question here, I think. I think that yes, I think that this is part of the future of fitness. I don't think it's necessarily going to replace all fitness, but maybe in 10 or 20 or 30 years, again, I'm always skeptical, but you never know what's going to happen. We could all be in VR in 10 or 20 years. The cool thing is in VR, there's endless opportunities to gamify fitness. So you can develop a game, you can change it, you can add things to it, you can make it more interesting all the time. It's a lot different than if you had, I kind of think I like the Nintendo Wii back in the day too, but that only had a few games and it was kind of exercise. We got to move around a little bit, but they weren't developing dozens of games a week. Like if you go on Steam right now, dozens of games come out in VR every week and every month. So there's endless opportunities here. There's always new modes of VR and AR as well. So we've been working with a couple different companies looking at things. This is called the Flycer. There's a couple different versions of it, but it's a VR system where you're kind of laying down. You use your upper body. And then these VR bikes are out from Nordic Track. I don't know if they're out yet for everybody, but these are the ones we were studying as well. So there's also these new modes. There's other companies building resistance training devices and stuff too. Right now it's mostly aerobic, but we're looking at resistance training. And then responsive exercise using AI, artificial intelligence. So this is the stuff that's going to come out. A lot of, you think the Peloton model, a lot of that's starting to use AI built into it to help it. So you don't necessarily need a personal trainer talking to you one-on-one. You basically have a virtual trainer that knows where you're at, knows what your goals are, and we can build that into it. So, I was a personal trainer too. I'm not trying to put all the personal trainers out of business, but I think that responsive AI with training is going to really help a lot. You still might need a trainer to help with diet and all these other things, but responsive AI is going to be really big. So is it the future of fitness? Again, I think, yes, it's definitely part of the future of fitness. And kind of the goals for our research at the VR Health Institute and at San Francisco State are really to look to develop effective, sustainable, and accessible VR and augmented reality experiences. And again, I think you'll start seeing the term XR kind of combine both of these VR and AR in the next few years as well. So what's our upcoming research? We've got a few projects going on. We're looking at VR and exercise and motivation. So that's what I had kind of mentioned before. I'm not a psychologist by trade. I dabble a little bit and I'm reading more, and I'm contacting a lot of sports and exercise psychologists to look at motivation and how that plays a role in adhering to exercise over time. We're also looking at VR and sports training, particularly soccer. In this case, we've got a lot of students interested in soccer. And then VR and cardiac rehabilitation, working with a group, Dr. Jamal Ozamek out at the University of Illinois, Chicago, doing some really cool stuff with VR and cardiac rehabilitation. So again, we typically work with younger, healthy adults, but we're expanding this. And I think VR, as far as accessibility goes with, rehabilitation or people with disabilities or older adults, it's going to be, really the sky's the limit with what we can do with this kind of stuff. So again, thanks for listening to this talk. Just some acknowledgments. We couldn't do this without our student researchers, couldn't fit them all up on the board, but this is just a handful of our researchers over the last few years that have really led this. I mean, I'm in the lab all the time, but I'm not the one calibrating all the systems and setting up the heart rate monitors and doing all the, the hard work. And so these students really deserve some acknowledgments. Also our collaborators, Dr. Kern, Dr. Lee, Dr. Lorenz, and Dr. Bolter are kind of our ex-phys statisticians and psychologists here that help out. And then Aaron Stanton, who runs the VR Health Institute. He's been integral in this as well. And then we've had funding and support from a few companies you can see on there. FitXR, who you're going to hear from here in a few minutes, has donated some of the headsets that we use to do research, as well as Nordic Track, Rossi Foundation, and then the VR Health Institute and the Cal State system. So again, thank you all for having me. If you're interested in contacting me, feel free, shoot me an email or contact me on Instagram, Twitter. If you're interested in our graduate program and you want to get involved in some of this research, we're always looking for graduate students. You'd basically apply through the standard Department of Kinesiology and then get in contact with me, and we can work on that. So again, thank you all for having me, and I look forward to answering questions later in the talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bagley. Next, we have Nejc Skoberne presenting on FitXR.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nejc. I'm the product manager at FitXR for our player experience team. And really happy, like that Jimmy actually said that VR is the future of fitness, because if that would be a negative answer, then we would have a very interesting, I think, debate in a couple of minutes. But I think I'm not going to take too much of the time, because I think there's probably like quite a few questions. I saw like a couple of them already posted in the chat as well. So like, I think that's going to be probably the best way, but still want to kind of give everybody insight of how, from a game developer and app developer perspective, we look at fitness, who we are, how does this game actually look like from a real life perspective, also versus like how in game that actually looks like. So let me see if we can get this thing working. One second. There we go. We can go through this. Perfect. So what you're going to see is one of our main power users from Japan actually being really playing the game from a class that we've created from start to finish. And this will give you like a really good perspective of how the game actually works and how do you actually behave as well from a outside in. So a very different perspective, but overall it will give you like a great insight. So who is FitXR? So FitXR, we're a leading VR and AR developer that really focuses on our core mission, which is that we provide fitness activities for everyone, anywhere around the planet. So we're really passionate about that mission, and that includes also like how do we provide great exercise to people with disabilities, and that's something that we're like really wanna like push forward as well. So how did we start? So we're a fairly young company. We only been like around for about 5 years, and everything started off in 2016, when two of our co-founders, Sam and Samir, met through a business school in London in England, and really kind of like both shared this passion for VR and exercise. And they thought this could be a potentially some kind of like a big idea here if we can actually execute it really, really well. So Sam, by nationality from New Zealand, comes from a background of finance and management consulting, whereas Samir comes from a deep experience of an expertise around casual mobile gaming, working for companies like Electronic Arts and PlayJam as well. So, and that was like created like a really good mix of from a two founders perspective. So about a year later, Box VR is born. So you'll hear me referencing Box VR quite a bit. So Our initial game was called Box VR, but later last year, we've rebranded our main game from Box VR into FitXR. And that is because we now support multiple, what we call studios. By studios, what I actually mean is just modes of exercise. So we started off with our boxing game that you currently see on the screen as well, which is really becoming an engaging and gamified experience overall. There's a couple of base moves that you can hit. So pretty much like jabs, uppercuts, and side hooks, and also mixes in squats. And those can be like left, right, or basic squats. Like I said, we're really passionate about our mission to provide exercise about everyone. So those squats can be turned off at any point. I also mentioned we rebranded from Box VR as we gain our initial traction and turn into FitXR. That is mostly because we've started adding the studio. So next to boxing, we also provide dance, which is choreographed, and you follow avatar. So it's completely inside the VR, and you get to learn all the popular dance moves out there. It's been really a big hit within the VR community of like everybody wanting to get the newest moves and also have fun with it. Just last month, we also launched our third studio, which we called HIT, or High Intensity Training, which is then a combination between the both studios. So think about the exercise that fighter pilots or Formula One drivers do, which is mostly around how fast can you react to something from a reflex perspective. And then we kind of like took that idea and we turned it and gamified into having a score, having a leaderboard, and really competing against like other players to push yourself harder. The difference between that HIT studio versus box or dance, for example, is really that you go at your own pace. So whether with box, like you see here, cues are coming towards you, and those cues are depending on what exercise you actually choose and what the difficulty of that exercise is. In HIT, you actually get to dictate because you're on a timer and you get to move as fast or as slow as you want to be. So that kind of, again, fits very well within kind of like our mission. So one of the things that we kind of like why we believe that fitness, the VR is really the future of fitness, is also our community. So our community is really at the heart of everything we do. And there's not a day that goes by we don't listen to them. We have an incredibly active group inside the game, or also like in different Facebook groups, Discord channels outside the game that we regularly interact with, and that we rarely listen to their feedback and also take that on board when it comes to our own product development. So for example, referencing again the HIT studio, that was one of like great ideas that came directly from our community. And through that community, we learned a lot of different use cases that we didn't think they exist when we started off back in 2016. One of them, for example, is we have a big player base in Japan. And in Japan, there is a very interesting cultural phenomenon called hikikomori. Hikikomori is basically the element of people that decide they don't want to interact with society. So they actively choose a lifestyle where they would not leave their own four walls. And FitXR and VR provides them that escape. And they're really happy with that escape. So we had a couple of user interviews from them and how they're happy that finally, next to just gaming, they can also like have a gamified exercising experience that wasn't available to them beforehand. On the other side, we've seen many stories of people losing more than 100 pounds of weight as well, which kind of like really inspires us to push even harder and like get this our kind of like game even more engaging and more gamified overall. We're obviously mostly present, as Jimmy also mentioned, on this thing here, which is the Oculus Quest. It's currently the biggest VR platform out there, and that also like reflects in our user numbers. but we're also like, we like to be platform agnostic, which again fits very nicely with our mission. So we're also present on the PlayStation VR platform, and we're also present on the Steam platform, which is then a bit more open towards more manufacturers of hardware devices. We'll continue to be very platform agnostic just to fulfill that mission going forward. So overall, to kind of like summarize, very much so, we are actively in a VR and AR development. That comes from the name. We have FitXR, like Jimmy also mentioned. We're looking to what can be done in this like mixed reality. We strongly believe that VR is a category that will stay on for the next few decades, and that we can actually create a more engaging experience. There's other elements that we're constantly developing through our R&D efforts, and how we include more exercises, how do we include different also like physical items that people can interact, but always, of course, in a very safe way, right? As soon as you introduce another physical item outside of just like the two controllers in your hands, that involves either some weight training, that involves either something to hold, which can also in a complete VR environment mean some dangers to our members. And that's something we take very seriously of. And at the same time, how do we make this platform even more inclusive towards all people with disabilities, and how do we also adapt our exercises towards them, either regardless of what those disabilities might be. And that pretty much is all about us in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nate, for your presentation on FitXR. And with that, we can switch to our Q&A session.
All right, so we can get started here. So thanks to both Jimmy and Nate for sharing with us, and hopefully this provided everyone with a pretty good cross-section of work being done with exercise and VR. So we have a couple questions from the chat that we can start with, and then if other people who are listening have questions, feel free to send them in the chat, or if you're willing to unmute and even turn your video on, feel free to do that as well. So we'll start with a question from Judy Deutsch, where they we're talking, this is for Jimmy, when you were describing your work to validate the PNOE system, and has that work been published? And if not, how many other studies have you seen to validate that system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, currently I think there's only one study on validation for that. And we don't quite have enough subjects, I don't think, to have a validation study. But from our experience using it, I think, again, at low intensities, it's probably great. But if you're going to do anything in different environments, the way that it measures VO2 is kind of nice. The volume measurements don't use a turbine, so there's less moving parts, but it uses a membrane. This membrane tends to be a little finicky with things like humidity and elevation, depending on where you're at. It's always foggy in San Francisco, so we were having some problems with that. So long story short, I don't think we're going to do a validation study, but I would use that one maybe more for your fun research, outside research, but probably stick with the CosMed or Parvomedics, or one of the more, Parvomedics are bulletproof, but they're huge and heavy. If you're doing some more things for validity and reliability, I would focus on using some of those more expensive, unfortunately, brands.
And Jimmy, have you used any? I know there are also wearable, systems sort of maybe in between the PNOE and the Parvo that are wearable. Do you have much experience with any of those systems?
Yeah, the only one I've used is the CosMed K5.
CosMed,
and again,
okay.
it's probably almost, if you don't get the 12 lead EKG, it's about the same price as the full metabolic cart. So, but those are
Okay.
pretty solid, I think.
Okay. Great. Okay, so Kristen has a question related to, so I think a couple people have mentioned Peloton. So she said when she goes on Peloton, there are lots of women riding a bike. When she goes on Zwift, totally different story. And that so these two types of, these two platforms seem to perhaps feed different communities. Do you all see the same thing in the world of VR gaming? And I guess this will be a question for both of you.
I can go on that one first. It's a very interesting question. So the biggest use case for VR even today still is predominantly gaming, right? And like that community doesn't really change that much. So it's predominantly male oriented, predominantly male dominated. For our perspective though, that is very interesting because we see exactly the opposite. We actually see a very equal split in our user base between males and females, which is very surprising even from an Oculus as a platform developer perspective, that we're like so evenly balanced, where our community has just flourished among both or all genders actually, to be fully inclusive. So it's fairly interesting how VR started off as this game centric and the main use case, but it has attracted quite a significant amount of females to the platform as well, but not just in gaming, but they are exploring other like fitness application and other work applications as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, which, and maybe to follow up on that question, is how do we, I guess those of you on the development side, right, how do you develop experiences that are able to reach a broader audience? One of the things that we talk about in our work as far as development is concerned is that people often don't know what they like, right? You can't necessarily go out and say, hey, what would you like to see in VR? You sort of have to, you need people who are very creative to come up with experiences and then show them to people, because your everyday person doesn't know what's even possible in VR. So from the development side, I guess that's maybe Nate for you, do you have any experience with doing these types of user-centered design in your company?
Yeah, we do, and it's quite interesting of the first time people experience VR, and especially like we call it like the aha moment, and then the secondary aha moment the first time they experience also doing fitness activities in VR. We predominantly think that onboarding, so first time as a user that comes through our app, that experience really needs to clearly explain the safety procedures and also what are also the basic moves and also the technique of those moves. We've had instances where our community has had injuries because of improper technique, and that's something that we definitely take very serious. So we have, before you try any new studio that you haven't tried before, we make it a mandatory thing for you to watch a tutorial video to actually see what the techniques are and what are the correct techniques to avoid injuries that much. Similar with the onboarding process, what we found out, if that onboarding process really is not engaging and really brings people in and explains what exactly that game is through a gamification method, users tend to drop off quite significantly fast. And for us as a membership model that is free to download, of course, there's no risk for any of the users to download and try it out. So that's something that we pay incredible attention to, and through user studies where we try out different prototypes when it comes to the onboarding process, we actually learn a tremendous amount of, especially for newcomers to VR, of how they would actually interact. And it's quite, in a lot of cases, a lot significantly different than somebody that's used a headset device for a couple of years, even going back to a fully wired headset device.
So yeah, I'd like to move in a slightly different direction. So Nate, you mentioned one use case, which at least for the, I think you mentioned a group of gamers in Japan who have sort of self-selected to be to just stay within their own home and not leave, and the game provides them with some sort of an outlet. It seems like there's also the possibility in general for virtual VR, generally speaking, and VR gaming, with respect to what we're discussing today, to have a social component to it, where either in real time you can play against each other, against people from across the world, right? That's kind of a dominant form of gaming in general. Or you could do things asynchronously, where your leader, I think I saw a leaderboard on one of the screenshots there. So can you maybe both talk about, just give your perspectives on the role of social interaction in maybe driving the future of VR gaming?
Yeah, I can take that one first. I didn't get to mention it, but before the pandemic, for about a year, we were doing VR gaming in our recreation center, student recreation center on campus. So we had 4 headsets over there with a big monitor, so students could, or people, anybody there could watch people play. And it started with 2 or 3 people kind of looking through the window, saying like, what's going on in there? And then after a while, they realized they could play against each other, or like you said, a leaderboard and follow it. The list of people that wanted to play it was totally way more than the 4 headsets we had. So we're trying to get ways to find more funding and space to do that. But I think in person, you can have a really great, conversations and stuff as you're playing with each other. But then, like you said, you can play across the country, across the world. I know Aaron, who we work with, plays tennis with his dad every Tuesday he's in Vietnam and his dad's in Kansas. So, just something like that where you can get together with family or friends, I think is a great option. But yeah, not just it. We've been studying these single player games just because it's kind of the first step, but then multiplayer games and big, huge games with hundreds or thousands of people in it are going to be really cool in the future, I think, too.
Yeah, like definitely. We actually are one of the, I believe, still the only fitness application, at least on the Quest platform, that enables multiplayer from the get-go, and that's something that's where it really kind of like gets competitive. Like you mentioned as well, the leaderboard is such a big driving force within the game of how far people push themselves and how competitive they actually want to be. And that is like a really important element as well from a motivation perspective. And that's something I want to touch on, because we pay the selection of who you actually get to play for us is incredibly important, because we want to give you a good user experience. So if you're not at the same level, for example, as the 7 other players, that can become quite a big issue and quite demotivating when users are getting 10,000, 100,000 more points than you. That's an experience we actually don't want to provide. So we want to put you in a very competitive scene where everybody is on a similar level, and we kind of like want to level the playing field so that it becomes this very engaging, very fun way that you don't even think this is exercise anymore. And that's ultimately like what it's all about, right? Having fun while actually burning calories is the main driving force for a huge chunk of our community, and doing it at home at the same time.
Great. Yeah, thank you both for those wonderful answers. So we have another question from one of our attendees, Julie Kay here, that relates to safety issues. So, and this is relevant also to a lot of work that we do in my lab. So there are some cases where we might want to provide games that are either designed to be used with disabled populations, people with different types of impairments, and specifically what people may have challenges with their balance and things like that. So have you all given much thought to how you might make games more accessible, or have either of you had experience dealing with any applying these games, using these games with any members of these populations?
Yeah, I could just start real quick. So what we have, you can see behind me, I've got a harness on this treadmill back here. That's a great way to start. So when we work with people in cardiac rehab and stuff like that, usually the games start where you're sitting, and then you can move to a standing mode, and there's a harness that you can attach. We can move that around a little bit. So that's a good way to start. But like you said, there's ways to change this. depending on what the disability is and stuff. Sometimes even people that are hemiplegic they can use one side of their body or the other, you can change the game to where there's only one controller or not. So that's some stuff we've done, but I think, yeah, it's totally adaptable and it's great depending on the platform you have.
Yeah, and similar from our end, right? So we take disability is probably at very close to like our core mission as well. So we do in our box workouts where we do have squats, we have that option for that to be turned off completely. We also pay quite significant attention that all exercises outside, of course, of our dance studio can be done both sitting down and standing up. And we have a very active community as well that gives us constant feedback on each and one exercise or actually class that we produce. And because we tend to produce a class and release a class every single day of the year, we have quite a significant amount of inventory where we get a huge chunk of feedback, back to us of how can we actually get better and how can we create more inclusive exercises and classes, regardless of which one of our free studios.
Yeah, and I think from our end, just like what Jimmy mentioned, so we've done VR-based or designed VR-based interventions that are both on treadmill and over ground, and we've done those primarily with people who have Parkinson's disease. So for the treadmill, we could use both a harness and a handrail to help people who might have balance impairments. For our overground work so far, we have been pairing the individuals with Parkinson's with their physical therapist. And so there's a PT who's standing right beside their patient, much like they would do in a normal therapy session. So that's one thing that we've done. And that work has focused on people who are more mild. But for us moving forward, at least for clinical applications, there are systems body weight support systems that you could install in a clinical space that would allow people to move, just walk freely in a room, but also protect them from falling. So these are overhead systems that are, essentially sort of struts and rails attached to the ceiling and walls. So I think that to make these things sort of universally accessible, coming up with a really cost-effective way to do this kind of harnessing and ensuring safety is going to be really important as people start moving around more and being mobile in these virtual environments. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions here. So I ask one more question as maybe people are thinking. So, I think maybe Jimmy mentioned this early on, when you're exercising in VR, you're sweating. And we often have this discussion about how to deal with, essentially sort of sanitary and sanitation conditions when using VR headsets, particularly if you think about like an arcade-like setup where multiple people use the same system. What are some things that maybe have and have not worked for you all when you're having multiple users use the same system?
Yeah, I guess for us, so we'll have 10, 15 people using the same headset in one day, which sounds kind of gross, right? But we do have they're really cheap, just little rubber coverings that go on there, and that's great. And then wiping down the goggles each time and the handsets every time is great. So that's been the easiest, cheapest thing we found right now. But I do think, I don't know what you all think, but the headsets that we have now they're going to look like that laptop I showed from 20 years ago really soon. They're going to get much smaller, and I think it's going to be just a lot easier to clean, hopefully soon.
Yeah, I know that there are companies that make these UV, the clean box, as Judy just mentioned, these UV-based sanitizing systems. We have one, another group in our division has one. and I would really love, we talk about validation studies, I'd really love for someone to publish a study that can give us all more confidence in what those sanitation systems are doing. All right, so let's see. So I have another question from Kristen. So this is for Jimmy. Are you doing more work on the perceived exertion differences that you observe? It seems interesting that people may categorize VR exercise differently and may then perceive things differently than more traditional exercise.
Yeah, that's one of the questions we're always going to be asking is perceived exertion. And we started doing, so we're getting into motivation and then even into cognition, which can change based on games depending on, who the person is. But perceived exertion, we're always asking, we're asking about fun. So is it fun or not? And then also perceived difficulty of the game, because all these things kind of go up and down. You want a game to be just hard enough to where it's still fun, but also still exercise. So we're trying to balance all these things, and that's always, going to be questions. But I think, in most of the games, like I said, that perceived exertion is really interesting to see it lower across the board. And we're starting to look at even older adults too, to see how that works with them.
And Jim, just to follow up on that, I think during your presentation, you mentioned this difference between reported and estimated RPE. Can you, maybe, I guess I didn't understand how those two things differ. Can you just talk about that for a brief moment?
Sure. So every participant that we have play, we actually have them do a VO2 max test on our treadmill beforehand, like not the same day, but a different day. And we'll get, let's say their heart rate or in their VO2 was at X, we'll look on the treadmill and see what they were saying, their RPEs 14, 15, whatever. And then we had them play the virtual reality games and their VO2 and heart rate were at that level, but they're 2 or 3 points lower each time. So yeah, that was actually not estimated, but their actual measured one on a treadmill.
Okay, yeah, so that's really cool. I think this, the beauty of VR is largely the psychological effect, right? Being immersed in a fully, sometimes surreal environment, being essentially a completely different person. All of these things can have a really huge effect on how you perceive your own movement. So some really wonderful work to be done in that space. I think we have time for one last issue. Okay, so Arun was posing a question about the weight of VR headsets, and this has come up for us as well. So essentially the current state of VR headsets, we have these headsets that are really front heavy. And so that can sometimes cause issues, particularly with older populations where they have to use their neck to maintain the weight. Have you all tried to address this issue at all in any of your work, either from the development side or just the testing end of things?
I can take that one first. Yeah, from a developer side, it's a very interesting problem to have because we don't dab into hardware specifically, right? So, and most of like the use cases, like I mentioned before, still is with gaming, and most of the VR population is on the younger side of the age spectrum. So that's what also hardware manufacturers are optimizing towards. The way we combat this kind of like issue is very much at the core of how we design exercises as a whole. So we try to make, and this comes really goes hand in hand working with our fitness instructors and our content creators of creating exercises where you don't need to move your head or your neck muscles that much, where we kind of like try to make that as static as possible. So the headset is firmly kind of like secure on your head, and that you don't actually tend to move those muscles quite significantly to also kind of like alleviate some of these things. So we wouldn't create an exercise where we would require you to turn your neck, for example, because we know that could be potentially an issue. So like you saw in the box example we have, is very kind of like linear of coming things coming towards you. So you're kind of like constantly looking into one direction.
Yeah, and it also depends on the setup you're using. You know, with the HTC Vive Pro, it has a connection, a little, I guess, cable, and we can actually hang that from the ceiling as well. So that would kind of alleviate a little bit of that, but it's not perfect. I think as they get lighter, it's going to keep getting better and better. Also, when we use VO2 mask setup, that actually takes off some of the pressure of the weight, but it's still not comfortable. So we're still trying to figure that out. I think the hardware stuff is going to get better and better, especially as companies like Apple are starting to dabble in this. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some kind of Apple VR, AR goggles or glasses in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I was actually just learned from a link that Julie shared with me a few days ago about the sort of next gen development of some of these VR headsets where they're much lower profile. So that's going to make the hardware a lot more accessible. And it's something that I know that we're looking forward to. All right, so we are at the 11 o'clock hour, 11 o'clock Pacific, that is. So I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap up here. So just like to thank both Jimmy and Nate for coming and sharing what you all are doing. It's really great to see what's happening in this space. A lot of us are, attacking this problem from different angles. So it's really great to learn something new here today. Thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Julie, or if you are still here. Thank you for hosting and organizing everything today. And so Julie posted a link in the chat where the recording for today's session will be posted. If you all are on our SMART-VR listserv, you'll find out about our upcoming events as well. So with that, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.